And so, yeah, so today I will, again, this is my, it's sort of a little bit of a baby, or Daniel and my baby that's grown out of it. Looking at this database of mentorship and trying to understand kind of the role of mentorship in the science of science, right? And so there's a database or an online resource, the Academic Family Tree, which most of you are probably familiar with. This is a project that I started with some colleagues a while ago, I guess close to 20 years ago, when I was a graduate student, which I started as sort of focused specifically on neuroscience, but has now grown into a much more interdisciplinary project. And so that's essentially a live resource that's collecting data, but also generating data for different research projects. And that formed the core or the mentorship side of this mentorship data set that we have, again, that we recently published, that links researchers and their mentoring relationships to publications, and can be linked, for instance, to mag data and hopefully soon to OpenAlex as well. So you have access to individual researchers, their relationships to each other in terms of training and their scientific and publication output. So what I wanted to do today is talk just generally about the academic family tree, and talking about it a little bit as a graph and how you can sort of take some of these basic graphic or graph analysis tools and apply them to real data. Then I was going to just briefly talk about a couple studies that we've published using the academic family tree, just give you some ideas about what you can do with this, also to kind of highlight some of the complexities. So I think there's some interesting, it's easy to do some quick analyses, but to really kind of convince yourself that you've learned something from the data is an additional challenge, and hopefully I can highlight that. And then in the last minutes, I'll work through a notebook that demos use of the mentorship data set, so that you can see how, for instance, you can really take some of these concepts we've talked about and start using them pretty much out of the box in SOS Hub. Okay, and I feel like we're only 2 days into this class. Maybe I don't even need to. Maybe I'm preaching to the converted already. But why are we interested in mentorship specifically as a part of science of science? Well, we know that science is humans. It's a social network, and the personal relationships are going to impact what happens in the field, right? So sociology, right? This is sociology. It's not just kind of pure knowledge, right? It's and really it's the interaction between the two that's kind of drives a lot of our interests. As far as mentorship, the thing that really got me thinking about it is that it's such a key part of your training, right? You really typically only work with 1 or 2 people during a very critical part of your training, and there's no one else you really spend that much time talking to and communicating with in your training. So just kind of inferentially, you think that, well, this must be important, right? So we should really understand what it is that mentorship brings into the scientific enterprise, if we want to understand how science works. I think just for those of you who've started or completed your training, you learn a lot as a graduate student, right, or as a postdoc, but it's multifaceted, right? You're learning science, right? You learn your sort of specific fields, the methods that you use, the experimental methods or analytical methods. But also you learn professional skills, right? And so you're a good mentor is not just someone who teaches you the nuts and bolts of your science, but also sort of helps you figure out how to navigate the world and succeed. So I think that makes it kind of very interesting as a problem, but also challenging, right? Because you don't, what aspect of the mentor's influence is really impacting people's careers down the road. And just kind of point out, I think most of us would agree that mentorship, in a very, very practical sense, is important, right? If you work for someone famous, they write a letter of recommendation for you, it's probably gonna help you out in a very measurable way. Okay, so while we're talking about graphs, mentorship networks are a very, very nice example of a directed graph, right? You have nodes and you have edges, and there's a relationship there where a mentor in our formulation points to a trainee, right? In the sense that this mentor is doing something to affect a trainee's career and experience. Okay, and here are two nodes. It's a nice simple network. Often, certainly in bioscience, which is where, again, most of my experience has been, you can have more than one mentor, right? So you might have a graduate mentor, a postdoctoral mentor. You could have more mentors, right, depending on how you define it. So today we're mostly talking about formal academic mentoring relationships, which would be your PhD advisor or your postdoctoral advisor. But like as we've sort of discussed, that many other things can take on the form of mentorship. But this is a graph, right? So your mentors had their own mentors, and they had their mentors, and so there's a large kind of network feeding into an individual trainee's experience, and that trainee will, if likewise, at least in some cases, go on to train their own researchers, and those researchers may go on to train others as well. So there's this large amount of input coming in, outputs going out, but of course it's a high dimensional graph in the sense that everyone in this tree can have multiple trainees and multiple mentors, right? So you can have, it becomes very large and potentially interconnected. So it's very easy to specify the sort of node edge relationship, but actually kind of visualizing the much larger graph and understanding the graph is kind of a challenge. Okay, so the academic family tree, this is my shameless plug for the effort. This is an online crowdsourced website. If you haven't been there, I definitely recommend that you drop by. If you're not in it, I recommend that you add yourself. And add your friends, add your colleagues. So again, it's sort of developed as just kind of a resource to learn. People could navigate, find out who their colleagues are. But what we've discovered as the tree has grown bigger, that it actually is a valuable resource for science of science. And so in addition to kind of this live website where you can browse the data, you also have a big database that we've exported. It's in the mentorship data set here. We also have a Zenodo repository at Zenodo that we update fairly regularly with just all the mentoring relationships and some other metadata that can be useful. Okay, so we're interested in mentorship, but of course, if we want to kind of study careers and just sort of individuals in science, there are a lot of different variables that we might want to measure, right? So there is this kind of formal training relationships or the genealogy that I kind of alluded to already in the graph, and that contains not only the nodes and the types of relationship. Also, time is something that I'll kind of get to a couple times here. The dates when the training took place is something very important to consider, and obviously, kind of embedded in some degree in the tree structure. But of course, the duration of training can be vary among researchers. So keeping track of the time of the training is important. And what we're interested in is understanding how that impacts kind of science more broadly. So of course, publications are kind of the currency. So we're interested in assessing kind of what scientists do, so we can keep track, for instance, of how much they publish or what the content of their publications are, who they publish with, and statistics like citations and H-index. Looking sort of more broadly across scientific enterprise, we can talk about things like funding. This is something where we've been acquiring linking data to individual researchers. Also, this is something we've spent a little bit of time on, but I think there's the area for expansion is just other types of awards, right? So Nobel Prize is the obvious one, but there are lots of other distinctions that scientists achieve that might tell you something about their career. Now that we've kind of expanded into the more sociology side of things, what becomes interesting is questions around, for instance, geography and demographics, right? So does where you do your training impact your career, or the sort of how mentorship impacts science? And of course, I think this is something that a lot of us are interested in, is demographics, right? So how do these sort of identifiers, particularly identifiers that are underrepresented in fields, how do they kind of play into these networks of mentorship, and how do things like gender, race, ethnicity, age, how do they sort of impact the outcome of mentoring relationships? So here's a screenshot of family tree for one person. This is Conrad Cording. Some of you may know his work. Daniel is obviously knows him, and he's kind of, I highlight him because he's kind of the link between conceptually between me and Daniel. I think if I had to sort of trace a kind of common thread in our research interests. Of course, he's also a common thread in many people's research interests. So I think you could think of him as someone with a sort of a high degree of centrality. And again, that's, it's family tree, right? So we're taking this graph and we're plotting it the way you might plot someone's genealogy, right? So all these names above are people who are involved in training and their mentors, and then all the names below are trainees and subsequent generations of trainees. So we can zoom in a little bit, so maybe you can read some of the text. There's Conrad. Here's Daniel, who spent some time as a postdoc in Conrad's lab, and so we can see that there's a single edge connecting these two researchers. Okay, and I talked about some of these very basic ways of characterizing graphs, and I'm a big proponent of just kind of looking at data and trying to understand just kind of big properties of it, right? And especially to kind of convince yourself that, well, does this actually make sense? And so one kind of very basic question you can ask is, if you have this big graph of mentoring relationships, you can look at things like degree, right? Or in this particular case, because it's a directed graph, we can compare in degree and out degree. So this is a histogram of out degrees. So this is saying for every node, how many trainees do they have? And then down here is in degree, which is for every node, how many mentors do they have? And I think you don't have to look very hard to realize that these are very different distributions, right? So it's possible to have many trainees. There are, of course, there are many trainees who just do not become mentors, right? So notice this is a logarithmic scale. So there are very large number of people who don't become mentors themselves. But then there also are these, you call them super mentors, right? These are people who have trained over 100 sort of individuals in their field, with a big spread in between. If we look at mentorship itself, I was actually kind of surprised. This was my little mini project this week to see if I understood something about my data. I was actually a little surprised at how many. It's not a huge number of people, but there are many people who have listed, sort of more than 10 mentors. And I was wondering, is this some sort of weird spam, or people are adding connections that aren't really real? Turns out that there are people who work in clinical fields who, when they're training, they'll train in a relatively large group, and they've just decided that all of these sort of senior faculty members in their department count as mentors. And so it's, again, you're looking at a logarithmic scale. So this isn't a huge number of people, but there are people who are listing themselves as having multiple mentors. But again, the vast majority of individuals are in kind of the 1 or 2 mentor range. The red bar here, so zeros accuracy. So this is yes, this is the challenge we're facing, right? So absence of a connection does not mean there is no connection. So this big red bar here with 0 are people who we have not identified their mentor, right? So again, you got to go back in time. You start getting, and if you browse around in the academic family tree, you can see we go back to people like Newton and Galileo, but at some point you do kind of run out of information, or maybe you just have people who weren't actually formally trained, right? So somewhere back in time are individuals who are not trained, but also there are many more contemporary researchers who we don't have information for. So this is you could call this a lower bound on the number of both of trainees and mentors, in the sense that there could be information that's missing. And I guess this is kind of the first point about dealing with real world data. You don't know what you don't know, right? So we don't know exactly what this graph should look like. And so that's something that we've spent a little bit of time on, right? We've done some point or sort of spot checks to try to assess how complete the tree is. And within the academic family tree, there's a certain amount of variability. Okay, and again, so this is so far we've talked about this graph as really just about mentoring relationships, and I think this idea of a graph is very helpful, but the Royce's talk kind of already led to
Stephen, there is a question from the audience from yes, says can these zeros come from
data actors? Yeah, so I was just answering that. Yeah, so basically, yeah, these red bars are zeros, and so those are either people who don't have trainees or we don't have data for, and the again, mentors who might be missing, or people who just are self-taught. So another kind of interesting perspective that has sort of only come clear to me as I've thought about this is that really there's more than one graph, right? If we want to talk about graphs, you can talk about knowledge graph being multidimensional, but you can also just sort of talk about different graphs laid on top of each other, right? So here's our nice picture of this trainee kind of living embedded in this bigger graph of mentors. But maybe what we're interested in is publication relationships, right? So, and here I'm just very schematically saying, okay, well, how many publications did this researcher co-author with various individuals in the graph? And so he or she may have written a paper with their postdoctoral mentor, a couple papers. They may have written a paper with another student in that lab, and maybe another collaborator from outside the lab. Here's a case where after graduation, this trainee may have collaborated with another trainee and written a paper, but then they also wrote some papers when they're working with their mentor. Then later in their career, the trainee goes on to become their own mentor, and they publish with their student, and again, some outside collaborator. So we can essentially overlay on top of this mentorship graph a new graph that's capturing information about co-authorship. And of course, there are many other graphs that we could talk about. Citations, which are an example of a directional graph. We talk about institutional affiliation, and maybe within this group we could think of some other types of graphs that might be overlaid that would involve the same nodes but different definitions of edges. And just I'm going to kind of mention in passing, very roughly, there's a time axis where mentors are trained before they become mentors, so we can really think of the vertical axis as going down, but the details of that are definitely going to have an impact on, for instance, the outcome of training relationships, the types of collaborations, right? Where we're looking in time is important. And so we've linked publications to researchers. This is getting better, and as I said, the mentorship data set that we have to work with here is much improved over the sort of first pass at linking to publications. Can edges have weight of year of mentorship? That is, so maybe the number of years that the students trained, I guess, would be that definitely you could give edges that weight. I guess the question is should someone who's been a graduate student for 8 years get more weight than the graduate student who was a student for 3 years? But again, yeah, I think that this is an example of taking a concept of duration of training and turning it into a mathematical formulation so you could perform some sort of analysis. So yes, you definitely can make edges have that weight. But the real challenge is saying, okay, analytically, what does this mean? What sort of model am I developing? How am I using this idea about duration of training to tell me something about the impact of mentorship? Those are very good questions. yeah, so this is, and I think that's maybe that highlights a point that, I can talk about nodes, I can talk about edges, but it's really, really critical to think about what the definition of an edge is, right? Because there are many ways to define them, and many ways, for instance, to define the weights of the edges. Okay, and so if you look on the Academic Family Tree website, you can see this profile page that gives information about mentors and trainees. We also have this publication data. There's this little, if you're logged in, again, if you're a good citizen, you can go in and you can validate these links, right? So the little question mark here means that we've inferred it, but it hasn't been validated. If it's correct or incorrect, you can actually check these little X's, and that gives us information to validate the linking system. So it's much appreciated. What we've done is taken the publication information and performed various semantic analyses. My work has been mostly on abstracts, but of course you can use full texts when they're available as well. So initially we did some very simple TF-IDF plus PCA based analysis. So we're using word frequency to we sort of identify the various important stems, and we can look at the frequency which these different words occur, measure kind of how frequently they're occurring relative to how frequently they occur across the larger population. And what that gives us is for every paper, we have some vector of weights. And you can perform PCA to reduce the dimensionality. And so we've had variously 400 dimensional vectors. And I think the specter analysis, which is a different embedding of publications, was it 1300? I can't remember how many dimensions it is. It's a higher dimensional and presumably capturing a much more nuanced sort of set of data about the semantic content. But just in a sort of abstract sense, what you can do is you can assign a vector to each paper, which is capturing kind of the position of an individual publication in this high dimensional space. You can average across individual researchers, and you can get you can have some representation of individual researchers based on the semantic content of their publications. And what's just kind of immediately jumps out to you is that this publication similarity graph and the mentorship graph are not independent. So here I'm just coloring in each node in the graph according to its semantic distance, or their semantic distance from this central node here. And I think it's pretty clear here that all these researchers down here that are dark, that means they have a relatively short distance from this person. If we look at mentors, we can see that there's kind of a dark band up here. So there's definitely some similarity to mentors. But if you go back in time, you can see that even you go back a few generations and there's still some relatively short distance between the node of interest and these much earlier nodes. And time, I keep talking about time, and I thought this is just kind of an interesting analysis. This also is one little mini project I've been working on recently, just to kind of get a sense of what the data look like. So you can ask, well, okay, what impact does a mentor actually have on their trainees? And here we're only looking at publications that were not co-authored by these two individuals. So we're kind of throwing out those publications because obviously they're going to be very highly correlated. And you can say, okay, so year 0 is the date that a mentor first published with either a graduate student, a postdoc, or just any kind of random co-author who's not in the mentorship graph. And then as a control, we can also say, well, what's the distance from just kind of a random person in the tree? And you can see, okay, so if you just take random researchers, people tend to be very distant from each other semantically, where people who you co-author with, you're definitely much closer to. But just to kind of point out, there's some interesting dynamics, right? So co-authors, you tend to maybe impact a little bit, right? So when you co-author with someone, they tend to sort of pull their publications a little closer to you, but then they kind of drift away over time. Trainees, what you can see is you're kind of yanking them down. So mentors kind of pull them towards themselves when they start training. And you can see these long-lasting effects where even after the trainees have left the lab, right? We're looking 20 years down the road. You can still see that there's some kind of lingering tendency to have publications that look like the mentor. And so this is quantifying something that I think, hopefully is intuitively obvious, that mentors are going to have an impact on the publications of their trainees, and crosses generations, right? So now we're looking at the same thing. So we're looking at the year, starting at the year when a trainee graduated, but we're asking, how does their work relate to their mentors, right? So their academic grandparents, and you can see that there's a similar effect where they're, and obviously there are lots of correlations here. So it's, I don't want to sort of speculate too much on the causality, but again, when you start working with someone, your sort of semantic output tends to be drawn not only to them, but also to their mentors, and that effect can last for many years as well. So anyways, this is a fun analysis I just started playing around with just a small subset of the data. I'd love if anyone here were interested in picking it up and exploring it further. Okay, so just to kind of continue with just kind of going through the types of data that are available, we've also been pulling down funding data. For better or worse, we're really focused only on kind of the traditional US funding agencies, pretty heavy in biosciences, but with a little bit in physical sciences as well. And so we can, and we have a little daemon that runs live. So every week we're downloading new funding data from the Federal Reporter, and we can link that using some disambiguation algorithms to individual researchers. And so this is an area that would be great to expand, getting things like the Department of Defense, private foundations, and of course, other countries. It'd be wonderful if we had access to that information. But even as it is, this is, I think this has been proven to be a pretty valuable data set. And again, just to kind of fill out the data that's available, we've managed to link gender based on first name. More recently, we also used geography as well, because as you're probably aware, the gender associated with the first name varies from country to country. And, but even just at sort of first pass, this is a pretty good way of classifying people according to gender. We've been working on race classification as well. I would say this is a much harder problem, but we've got some evidence that you can do this above chance. And then age, this is not something that we've really spent too much time on, but there are a few different kind of factors or variables that might be interesting. For instance, does a more senior mentor versus the junior mentor influence their trainees differently? And you can just use training information to infer sort of where someone is in their career based on the time that they completed their training. And again, here, this is just taken from this paper, but this is, for those of you who like to think about sort of database plot diagrams, this is the schema for the database that has information about researchers, their mentorship connections, their authorship on papers, and the metadata associated with the papers. So this is what's available to you if you want to start working with this data. Okay, I'm doing time-wise. Is it finish? Okay, still have a few minutes right there. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So this is something I think we talked about, this idea of predicting success, right? So we want to sort of figure out, well, okay, what makes a good mentor? What makes a successful training relationship? This is probably a very kind of entry level sort of conceptual slide here, but obviously you want to become a great athlete, you want to get some sort of MVP award, you want to be a great scientist, you're angling for Nobel Prize. That's one way of measuring success. In a kind of more kind of mundane world, well, I want to get a job, right? So can I get a job as a professional athlete, or can I get a faculty position? And that's kind of certainly one step on the road to success in academic research. And again, so that's a working definition that we have, which is success. And so maybe there's a better word for this, continuation. But what we're interested in understanding is, well, what factors cause trainees to stay in science? And in particular, one way we have of measuring it is becoming faculty so that they themselves can train new mentors, right? And I don't think this is this is actually a very valuable definition, because when you think about kind of evolution of fields and research, well, the trainees who come back into a field and continue the work are going to be the ones who shape the direction that a field goes. And so from the point of view of kind of the development of knowledge and science of science, this particular definition of success is actually, I think, a valuable one. And so I was just going to very briefly go through a couple kind of vignettes, I guess you could call them, that just summarize some analyses that we've managed to perform and convinced ourselves that we actually have some meaningful results out of. So this is a paper from a couple of years ago on a project that Daniel was involved with, looking at this kind of sort of how does drawing on the ideas of your mentors impact your later career, and what should you do intellectually in order to have a successful academic career. And then more recently, we've been looking at these questions of gender, and how does the gender of your mentor matter in determining the outcome of your training career. And this is something we have a preprint out. We actually it's been very recently accepted, so it's now in press, but the preprint is available here. Okay, so in this study, we were interested in trying to understand what it means to succeed based on kind of your intellectual relationship with your mentors. And in this particular case, we're focusing on bioscience, where very often trainees will have two mentors, of the PhD mentor or graduate mentor and a postdoctoral mentor that's kind of rounding out their training. And we're trying to understand, here in this sort of network graph, or a cartoon that captures the kind of important features of the mentorship graph. The success, again, is this trainee goes on to train their own students. We call this proliferation, right? So if you have trainees, then you're proliferating. And so a successful career in this case is someone who has greater than 0 trainees. And the question is, well, okay, so if we look at sort of information about mentorship network of the position of the two mentors and also their publication metadata, can we predict something about the likelihood that this trainee is going to become successful? And there was a hypothesis that we brought into it, which is this idea of synthesis. So if you are kind of moving science ahead, one idea is that what you're doing is you're linking ideas that haven't been linked previously. And in this training triad, the idea was that, okay, so there's some work that the graduate mentor has done before. There's some work that the postdoctoral mentor has done before. And so they have a bunch of colleagues, they have a bunch of collaborations, but maybe there's this gap, right? There's some conceptual distinction between those two areas of research that a trainee can really pull together and make their own, right? So this, again, for those of you who are launching on careers, this is a very sort of practical bit of advice, right? You want to carve out your own new territory. So a good way to do that is to work with people who work in slightly different areas and draw on that in order to make your own area of research. And maybe that will also advance your fields as well. So getting data, this is, again, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but just to kind of touch on a few practical details. What we're interested in is kind of well-characterized training triads, right? So we needed people with graduate and postdoctoral advisors, and we needed them to finish their training early enough that we could assess whether they went on to have their own trainees as well. And so this is this big database showing kind of where different fields are sampled in the academic family tree. It's also interesting how different fields have very different proliferation rates. So again, you can kind of this is out degree. So you can sort of see that there's some differences there. This analysis focused primarily on life sciences, these fields in red, as I said, just because those are the fields that tend to have these training triads. And so this is kind of another plot of the one that we were looking at earlier, looking at out degree. And this is saying for mentors in our triads versus trainees, what's the distribution of proliferation rates or out degree? And a couple things, well, a couple features come very clear. First of all, there's this kind of double exponential distribution where most mentors, we're looking at average number of trainees in 10 years. So most mentors have this peak around 1. And that's true of the next generation as well. But there are many, many trainees. This is kind of a cutoff that just have no trainees of their own, right? So many, many people don't continue. Those that continue have about the same distribution of trainees as their mentor. And another thing, which I think I've already kind of highlighted in the previous graph, is that trainees tend to have much more similar publication content than just random people in the network, right? So similarity is 1 over distance or times 10. That was just kind of an arbitrary distinction. But so the 2 mentors who would train a person tend to be more similar to each other than 2 random people in the network. So very rarely does someone go work for 2 completely random people. Instead, they tend to work with people who are somewhat closely related in the field. And so what we did is we built a model to say, okay, well, what features in this network based on these variables that I've talked about can predict whether someone will have continue or not. And we're fitting what's called a zero inflated negative binomial. And that's meant to capture this very big peak at 0, right? So there are many trainees do not continue as mentors. And then those that do vary in the number of trainees that they have. And so that's what this is capturing is just, again, there's a sort of initial binomial, which is how whether the person continues or not. And then there's a second output, which is the number of trainees or the proliferation rate that the person goes on to train. And using just a relatively straightforward generalized linear model framework, we asked, well, which of these variables predict whether someone will continue or the number of trainees that they have themselves. And so again, that's the proliferation rate of the mentors. This is something that's been identified previously. Big labs tend to produce people who go on to be have big labs themselves. But the question we were really interested in the synthesis case is, well, do this, sort of as this person goes on to do the research, how similar are their publications to their mentors, and also how similar are their mentors to each other? And then there's some other variables, just how many publications and time as a factor. See, is very important, but maybe for reasons that are not so interesting. And just to kind of take a bunch of analysis and show you how you can distill it down. This left-hand column is showing the odds of continuing. So basically continue or not to continue. And then this is sort of the impact on the number of trainees that if they continue, how many trainees the researcher will have in their independent career. And so this, I don't know if this is a interesting, disheartening, or heartening. So basically, as time has passed, the odds of continuing have decreased. So as sort of the pool of trainees has grown, the number of trainees, the continued faculty jobs has gone down. Again, that's something that's pretty well established. Here also the graduate and postdoctoral proliferation rates or mentor rates, right? This is how many other trainees they tend to have a positive impact on careers. So those big labs, big research groups tend to beget successful researchers. But the questions we were interested are down here, which is it's kind of the result that kind of struck us was that if we look at the 2 mentors, so how similar are the publications of 2 mentors with each other, we actually see that has a negative impact. So what this suggests is that training with mentors with different semantic sort of labels, right, different semantic features can have a positive impact. Again, sort of suggesting that what we want to do is work with 2 people with very different expertise, but what's important is also to maintain a connection with them, right? So you can't just simply train with them and then go off and do your own thing, but you need to have a positive correlation with your mentor in order to kind of achieve the synthesis that's gonna produce the success. So working with different mentors, but and then maintaining some kind of intellectual link with them in your independent career. So I think I already kind of highlighted that here, looking at the sort of once the researchers achieved an independent position, what factors, those were a little bit less clear. Again, we saw just coming from big labs tended to lead to big labs and producing large numbers of publications. So we didn't see the semantic and sort of synthesis effects in the success of the lab, right? But again, as you can see, the error bars are a little bit bigger on this and maybe a harder number to predict. Okay, so then let's see if there are any questions. I'm just kind of buzzing through this, and again, this is published work, so you can look at this in your free time if you want. But hopefully, it just gives you some ideas about how how you can link this information about publications and mentorship relationships. So then a study that we've started more recently, and again, this is kind of continuing, sort of reflects part of a continuing collaboration with Daniel, is this question of gender, right? And these demographic variables and how they play a role in mentoring relationships and just the scientific enterprise more broadly, right? And this graph is one of those ones that just kind of opens your eyes a little bit, right? This is showing sort of over 20-year periods how many women were awarded the Nobel Prize, and yeah, there weren't too many women awarded Nobel Prizes in the early 1900s. Many more were awarded Nobel Prizes in this century. So 19 women got the Nobel Prize since 2001. The question, how many men got the Nobel Prize in that same amount of time? I don't know if anyone wants to guess, if anyone knows. Anyways, well, many. There we go. Yes, indeed. So 149, right? So this pretty imbalanced ratio of men and women winning the Nobel Prize, and that's again, this is just one kind of way of looking at the data, but it kind of highlights just the very clear differences between gender in just academic research in general. And so yeah, this idea of leaky pipeline is something that's well established and kind of starts getting at the issue a little bit, right? So if our goal is to kind of balance gender, how do you do it, right? Well, one obvious thing is, well, let's just recruit more students, right? And if you can balance gender of students, and so if you can recruit more women in this case, then what you should be able to do is get more women winning Nobel Prizes. But there's this very consistent pattern, and this is we're actually correcting for something. So typically when people talk about the leaky pipeline, they talk about how many graduate students are there now, how many postdocs are there now, how many faculty are there now. But this is actually including kind of the career trajectory of individuals. So if we start with the sort of all the women, the ratio of, if we normalize so that we have balanced gender ratio among graduate students, we can follow the careers of these students in the mentorship graph. We can ask, well, how many of them become postdocs? How many of them become mentors? And so what you can see very clearly here is that the ratio of women to men decreases successively at each stage of the career. That's this idea of the leaky pipeline, where just for whatever reason that isn't completely understood, women are choosing to stop pursuing careers in science at each stage of the training. And this is something that you see across every field. So this, we've broken down the data according to the sort of major areas of research identified by the National Science Foundation. And again, this is looking at the ratio of trainees. And then if we look at who continues on to become a mentor, you can see that pretty much everything is over this line of unity slope. So the ratio of trainees is much higher than the ratio of mentors. 50-50 would be gender parity. right? And so there are actually a number of fields where the trainees are more than 50% women, but only in education are there actually more than 50% women mentors. And these red and blue dots are maybe a little bit confusing initially, but what we're doing is we're breaking the data up by the gender of the mentor. And so red dots are women mentors. And what that's showing is that very consistently across every field, women mentors tend to have more women students. And there's this that kind of highlights this idea of homophily, which is that that people tend to gravitate towards, trainees tend to gravitate towards mentors that have the same gender as them. And again, that's something that's true across every field. And so the question for us has been, well, so, okay, there's this clear leaky pipeline so that women trainees are less likely to continue in research. And the question is, well, does the gender of the mentor matter? And that's particularly salient because we see that women trainees tend to work with women mentors. And if for some reason there's an advantage or disadvantage with a particular mentor gender, this homophily could impact one of those groups disproportionately. And so this is just kind of a first pass at the analysis, fairly raw data, where we're just asking, okay, among these groups, so man trainee, man mentor, woman trainee, woman mentor, and the various crosses over between them, what's the likelihood of continuing to these independent research career for these different groups? And so there's a big separation, again, the leaky pipeline. So men trainees in general tend to be more likely to continue. But if you kind of squint and look at this raw data, even you can see that the trainees of women mentors tend to be on a slightly lower line, which suggests that for some reason training with a woman mentor may produce a disadvantage if your goal is to achieve an independent research position. And so we quantified this kind of after controlling for time. And so again, this is the 4 different groups. And what you see is that indeed, both for women and men trainees, that the gender of the mentor does seem to matter. So across the entire database, across different fields, we're seeing not always significant effects, but we're seeing the same trend in every field. And to some degree, we're seeing it both at the PhD to postdoc transition and the postdoc to mentor transition. So it does suggest that there's something in the data supporting this observation that women mentors, or trainees of women mentors, are less likely to continue. Okay, so that's something that becomes a pretty weighty issue. And for those of you who are interested in this work or follow this work, you might be aware of from that list of retractions that those mentioned in Slack recently. There's a study a few years ago that used a different data set. This was using co-authorship, but again, inferring the gender of co-authors, and slightly different criteria, but basically made this claim that, okay, if you have more female mentors, as they've inferred them from the authorship list, that tends to negatively impact the papers. There's sort of it decreases the impact of the paper. So in other words, papers with a large number of women mentors tend not to be cited as much. So this study was published, received massive criticism, and was retracted primarily because of, at least superficially, because of technical details. I'm not going to comment on it too much, but I feel like part of the issue was that it just raised a result that people didn't want to hear, right? They didn't, this sort of claim that women mentors are somehow bad and somehow negatively impacting the careers of their trainees was not something that people liked hearing. And I'm just going to go out there and say that was a large reason why this paper was retracted. Of course, there were some technical issues around it as well, which you could debate whether whether retraction was justified. But you can imagine if this is how a paper making claims about the the impact of mentor gender is going to be received, it makes us a little bit nervous about this particular analysis that we've got, because we're essentially replicating the result that was reported by this paper. So possibly to our relief, but also maybe just as a kind of a more nuanced description of this and sort of understanding of this problem. And I think to kind of highlight why this kind of multifaceted representation of these types of relationships is really valuable. What we concluded in our study is that it's not really the gender that matters, right? It's not anything special about women mentors. But what it is that women mentors in general tend to not be as successful or have higher status as men in their fields. And so what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at these various measures of success, so for instance, funding rate, the rank of the institution where someone is working, the number of trainees that they have, or H-index, right, the impact of their publications, these are all kind of typical ways of characterizing how high status someone is. And if you compare just the pool of mentors that we were analyzing, what you see is that men who are in blue all kind of show up in this heavy tail, right? So definitely up in the sort of superstar region, that area tends to be dominated by men mentors. But you can kind of see that goes all the way through the distributions, right? So that in general, again, I think the reasons why this is true is something that is very complex, but men mentors tend to be sort of higher up in all of these status matrix or metrics. And so we ran a multivariate regression, very similar kind of analytically to the one that I described for the previous study. And we could ask, okay, so if we account for the success of these or the status of these mentors, can that explain some of the differences that we see in gender? And so this graph has a lot embedded in it. So we draw it to an aggregate status metric. Essentially, it's the first principal component of all these status metrics that I plotted over here. And so a more successful or higher status mentor would have a higher rank. And now we can ask, okay, for each of these different groups, what's the probability of continuation depending on the sort of gender of the trainee, gender of the mentor, and the status of the mentor. So hopefully it's pretty clear from this plot. First of all, you can see the separation of colors, similar to what we saw before. So women trainees tend to have lower continuation rates, as do men trainees, but there's a very strong effect of rank, right? So higher status mentors are much more likely to have trainees who continue. And the observation is, well, if there are more men up at this end of the rank and more women over this end of the rankings, that can explain some of the spread that the mentor gender is producing. And so now if we just look at marginal effects, so we're asking, okay, how do these different variables, mentor status, mentor seniority is kind of a control, mentor gender, trainee gender, and time, you can see, okay, so here we're replicating the negative impact of time. Sorry, this is if the trainee is a male. So a male trainee has a much stronger likelihood of continuation. But if we look at mentor gender, if we ignore status, that's the gray bar here, that's a pretty large effect. If we incorporate status, we see basically a 50% reduction in the effect of the mentor's gender. So for us, that was a conclusion that a lot of these mentor gender effects are actually can be attributed to these differences in status that we see between mentors. And this is just breaking it down by the different factors. Turns out that H-index, so your mentor's H-index, can explain about 50% of the mentor gender effect. And so these other factors are important, and actually the aggregate status it was very highly significant, but didn't quite get up to the level of H-index. But what that does suggest is that so it's at sort of face value, okay, yeah, there's some difference, some impact of mentor gender. It turns out that probably that's because of these kind of larger network effects, right? So if there's a group that has higher status that happens to be correlated with gender, then that's going to kind of sort of create these correlations that you'll see if you only look at gender itself. kind of highlighting an important kind of aspect of this work, which is that if they're unknown covariates, right, you're going to have a hard time definitively saying what the cause is of a particular observation. Okay, so that's it. There's obviously a lot, there are a lot of details in these things. The hope here was just to give you a very kind of broad overview of the types of data that we have and the types of questions that you can ask. Just to kind of summarize, a single graph probably doesn't do it, right? There's a lot that's going on in the science of science, and being able to kind of generate multiple graphs and identify the links between them, I think is where the interesting stuff is happening. Time, I'll just say it again. So neuroscience, time is like a hard problem. So I love time, but I think this is something that we as a field really need to be dealing with, right? Because science is changing, right? So if you take a snapshot in one place, you can have a much different picture, and just always need to be taken into account, either as kind of the interesting topic or some potentially very large confound. And then just briefly, just when we talk about mentorship itself, there's a lot going on, right? So many things matter, right? Synthesis, being able to kind of bridge ideas between researchers seems to be important. And again, for better or worse, having access to prestige and resources tends to do you some good. So there's some value, whether you like it or not, to being in a well-connected clique is gonna benefit you in the long run. All right, and so just to real quick mention just a couple of the postdocs who were involved with this work. Jean Lénard was involved with that synthesis analysis, and Leah Schwartz, who was actually a student in S4 last year, was sort of the key player in the analysis of gender and mentorship. Okay, and I think, oops, oh weird, my slides go in a circle. So that's good. Okay, and that's it. Let's see, there's a question. Does bias of numbers in women scientists affect the results? Yeah, so that's a very important control. So we're always looking at things from the perspective of individual researchers kind of conditioned on the mentor gender. So yeah, so you have a much smaller pool of trainees of women, but we can ask within that pool what fraction are continuing versus the pool of trainees with a man mentor. So first of all, so yeah, there's an imbalance. There's still an imbalance now, right? And so I guess maybe to kind of get back to the point, this idea of the leaky pipeline and temporal dynamics, right, are an issue, right? So if I just take a snapshot right now, I will see fewer women postdocs and fewer women faculty, but of course that's reflecting history as well. So even if everything became perfect today and all new trainees went on to have, kind of perfectly balanced careers, it would still take a while for the numbers to balance out, right? Because you have this history of a male-dominated field. So and so that's something, yeah, definitely these temporal variables. That's exactly an illustration of the impact of temporal variables. And again, so something we did here to deal with that. And again, I'm kind of pointing this out because this was something that helped me kind of understand things a little bit better. Was where again we can look at the individuals. So this person completed their training in 2005. This is whether they continued on as a postdoc. Or they started their training in 2005. Did they continue as a postdoc, and did they continue as a mentor? So again, the fraction of women is not necessarily 50-50 here, but we can kind of control for that. And again, we're looking at the same cohort in order to balance those effects and avoid these kind of long-term trends that would, for many reasons, have the male-dominated fields kind of bias things.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
In the last slide that you just showed, did you only consider women who did a postdoc, or you also considered people who continued to be a mentor without going for a postdoc?
So in this particular case, I'm trying to think. I think we only, so we're only looking at, how did we do it? So all the people who became mentors went through postdoc, and we were just sort of looking at that subset of data. People who went, we just excluded individuals who went directly from mentor to postdoc, I believe. It's a good question. In bioscience, it's a very, very small number. You know, probably around 1%. So, but good question. It would change things a little bit if, depending on whether we included those mentors. I guess the point being,
Yeah.
there may be a few people who skipped a postdoc and went on to become mentors, which again, those could be both men and women. So this is just looking at the ratio of men and women. So I probably actually would not change things too much, but it'd be good to know.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see, any other questions? Okay. So, so that's all we have for network science today. Yeah, appreciate your questions and comments. Definitely happy to you know, obviously I've already kind of talked to a number of you about some of these mentor related questions. Yeah, just looking forward to talking more, seeing what kind of ideas and results you come up with. So definitely happy to keep the conversation going. And I guess now we got a little bit of a break. I don't know, you can eat lunch or dinner or whatever it is. And or I get to go eat breakfast. And then we
yeah, so the next session is in 47 minutes. I'll put a countdown on the screen so you can see it. So enjoy lunch, breakfast, or whatever, some of the snack. We'll be back with the talk.
Great.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks.